Our next speaker looks like he is on Chris Rogers. We're sticking with the regional theme here.
Sounds good.
And Chris Rogers is a faculty member at Massey and knows New Zealand racing. He also is notable when we talked about the first phase of the maintenance quality system, where I think he's published the only paper that describes the geometry of racetracks in a racing jurisdiction. Which, I mean, at the time it seemed like a low-hanging fruit, but it's definitely a niche need, right?
That's for sure. Yep. Yeah, only one boring enough to go around and measure a bunch of racetracks, that's for sure. But yeah. Okay, do you want me to take it away, Mick?
Take it away.
Okay, let's go shopping. I'll just introduce Kylie Legg, who's here with me. Michaela's currently in Saudi Arabia, so she can't, but Michaela and Kylie are the ones that do the work, and I sort of dream up the ideas. So what you're going to see is basically their work with sort of my prompting.
Beautiful.
Yep. Sweet. Excellent. Okay, rightio. Let's go shopping. Okay, so probably a couple of things, and it harks back a little bit to what Peter was saying, is that the differences between jurisdictions. And so it's a little bit, it's not teaching you to suck eggs, but it's a little bit of a quick summary of where we sit in New Zealand, because we're a little bit different, perhaps, to some other jurisdictions. We're regulated by one body, and we race on multiple tracks year round, and they're predominantly turf tracks. We've only just introduced synthetics in 2021, and that was partly to address the seasonal variation that we have sort of observed, and we'll present some data to show that to you. As a general rule, because of the seasonality in the way that we race, our racing pattern is structured that we tend to have our higher grade races in spring and summer, and then winter we have our lower grade races. And you'll see that when we show you the penetrometer or the track condition score data, because we tend to end up with these heavier what we refer to heavier tracks. And so it's not conducive to the better class of racing. So we tend to run that spring, summer, autumn with those better class horses on those better tracks. We've got a single regulatory body, and I've got a little scatter diagram, well, it's not a scatter diagram, a little map in the top corner to show a little bit the geography, because it's an interesting little country, and that I'll show you some work that Jack Murphy did early on about the composition of the tracks and the underlying soil type. But we've scattered, it's a long, skinny country, and because of that, relatively high rainfall. And so most of what we're working against rainfall rather than trying to work the other way around. All right. Okay. One of the things that sort of, we talked about the differences between jurisdictions and the idea of differences between surfaces, and Mick highlighted that, I probably am one of the most boring people that would go around and look at track geometry, but track geometry is sort of really quite interesting because there are differences between the racing jurisdictions. In New Zealand, we tend to be relatively consistent, and I guess it harks back to when we sort of found the areas where we were going to set it up. They tend to be oval tracks, so we race on about 49 tracks. About 7 of those, you'd say, would be raced once or twice a year, and then the remaining tracks would be the ones that we race relatively consistently on. As I sort of alluded to, the idea of the seasonality, we do race and we run on a similar pattern to Australia, where we have race days rather than meetings. So horses are housed at a race training venue, and then we'll travel and race at a track for one day and then come back to their training venue. Where was I going with that? Oh yeah, so because of that, we tend to change the pattern of which tracks we race on depending on the season and their ability to tolerate that the load or the water load and rainfall during winter. And so that results, and I've got some data on the next slide, results in a relatively consistent, despite the variation in seasons and rainfall, relatively consistent track conditions in what we race on. Most of our tracks, and I've got a diagram there in the right-hand corner, which is of our local track. And most of our tracks are that oval diameter. We tend to run in a counterclockwise manner. And so when we start thinking about the idea of the consistency of loads and the nature of loads, we're actually quite predictable in the geometry of the tracks, the relative loads and the relative going on those tracks. And when we sort of did some estimation, we looked at the relative speeds these horses were running at and the aspect ratio of those tracks. It works out that they're exposed to a relatively consistent, and it was just a relatively crude calculation of centrifugal force to get a bit of an idea of the relative loads on those horses, because, you know, we didn't have instrumentation on every horse that races in the country, but it provides a nice proxy of the relative loads across the different tracks. What's probably of interest is the idea, and I think it alludes to, and I think Mick's paper that was published last year highlighted it really nicely about the idea of the radius of the turns in the aspect ratio. And so we tend to have, because we've got an 18-meter circumference track, they tend to be basically a little bit larger than the US. And so our aspect ratio and our turn ratio is slightly larger than what you traditionally see in the US. The figure I've got there, which is of Awapuni, you'll see a green track and then a brown track on the inside, which is our synthetic. As sort of a frame of reference, the synthetic tracks in New Zealand, the three that we've got, which is they're divided geographically in the north, central districts, which is us, which is Lower North Island, and then in the middle of the South Island, tend to have an aspect ratio and a configuration that is closer to those that we sort of observe with the US tracks. So in contrast to the US, where I think from memory you tend to put turf tracks on the inside of your dirt tracks, we've got grass tracks, which we've then put synthetic tracks on the inside. So that sort of alters the relative loads on our synthetic tracks compared to what we see. What have you got there? Oh, yeah, reduction to about 20 tracks that we race on in winter to try and create that. The aspect ratio generally means that the nature of the turn, it's a 20% reduction in the arc relative to the true radius of that circle. And that's pretty consistent of what we have here. The diagram in the bottom right-hand side is some work that Jack Murphy did where he looked at 29 tracks and he actually looked at the soil composition and was looking at the variation that we had. And you can see it's fairly well clustered, but a bit of variation, some moving towards that clay loam and some moving right up to sand, where we've got a couple of tracks on the west coast where we are, and on the west coast further north, which are predominantly sandy loam, and we tend to race on those, which give us that consistency in our relative track going, even though we're racing on a variety of tracks. Oh, and yeah, I'll show you some data. Yeah, you can talk about the coefficient of variation a bit later. So this is just the idea of going. In New Zealand, we've been using, that's on the next one, we've been using the penetrometer as a routine measure of recording racetrack going since about 1992. And so this is just some data giving you the indication of that seasonal variation between tracks. So if we look at the top line there, the median penetrometer rating, it gives you an idea. This is the measure, and we use a similar format to the Australians in that it's based on 30 measurements across the track. We tend to take the first measurement that we report for race day is based on a measurement taken at 6:30 in the morning. So that is the officially declared racetrack penetrometer rating. And based off that, they will then make which I've got in a subsequent, they'll then report it as a going and as a track condition score. And that's partly to work towards the punters and the trainers, because the trainers like to have basically a qualitative descriptor. And so we use our quantitative penetrometer to then use that to provide that qualitative descriptor for the trainers, because trainers really don't, and unless it's talking about finishing times, they don't really like numbers. So if we have a look there, if we go across, you can see despite, and we do get quite a lot of rainfall in our winter, you can see that our mean penetrometer rating, and this is based across those large number of tracks, is about 2.7, 2.3, 2.7, and then in winter 4.3. So the unavoidable heavy tracks in winter, but as a rule, when we're doing the majority of our racing, it's in our spring, summer, autumn, you can see it's relatively consistent. If we look at the very bottom line there, it's the idea or the indication of whether we've got movement in the track and what the nature of that movement was. And so If we do have a change in track going, then they will go out and again record with the penetrometer to quantify what the track is and then reclassify the going. So again, it comes back to being based on that quantitative data rather than qualitative. And that gives us a little bit of a frame of reference there. And you can see that we tend to move the idea. It's basically, if we do get some change and we measure it, it's a change in about 1. So we're starting to get a little bit of variation, but when we look at where if we've got number of race meetings with a change, it's relatively low, but we do record it and do quantify it. Okay, so the penetrometer, and the penetrometer, well, this was developed, the one that we use was developed by Jack Murphy. The idea is basically it's a very clean instrument, 1 kilogram mass dropped from basically 1 meter height with a 1 centimeter square rod that penetrates the ground. It works well. We find it works well because the track managers can use it. They can report the readings, and people understand it. It was primarily developed. It wasn't developed. The penetrometer that we use wasn't developed primarily to measure track from an understanding of injury or anything. It was basically to tighten up the way that tracks were reported and the methodology in describing it, because you end up with large variation, because it has a huge impact on if the track is graded too heavily. If people are using a qualitative scale, then there is the driver to underreport that because it has a large impact on betting turnover. People tend to avoid those heavier tracks. And so by having the penetrometer as that guide, it removes that variation, the ability for people to tweak or to alter the descriptor of the track. So this is it's a combination of data. You can see here, a lot of our horses travel backwards and forwards to Australia to race. So our track rating, and if you look at our rating and our descriptors, you'll see that they're very similar, or basically are identical to what Peter presented. And that's part of the strong relationship between New Zealand and Australia with racing, because we want Australian punters to be able to understand what our tracks are, and we need to understand when we go to Australia what the impact is on our horses. So we use the same descriptors. What we have there are the penetrometer measures, and this is the values for the penetrometer, which are then used to provide the track rating and the descriptors, which are used in the official publications. Now, these are collected, because these are collected and reported, we get these, New Zealand Thoroughbred Racing records these on their official race transcripts, and it's part of the official data set that is available for analysis. So we have these for every race meeting and every trial start. On the top right-hand side, it just gives you a bit of an indication. This is some data that Jack Murphy presented, which is the relationship of the penetrometer reading to the actual race times here at Awapuni. So to give you a bit of an indication of the nature of the point of inflection and the idea of the linearity, and we'll have a little bit of a look at this in the subsequent slide. The data on the left-hand side really is trying to give us a bit of an indication over, well, how many years have we got there? 12 years, isn't it? 12 years data to give an indication of the variation in what is reported, which is the rating, because the rating defines the terms that are used, and the penetrometer measures. And you can see basically because of the fact that once we get to heavy, there's a bit of a tail, there's a bit more variation at the end. But where we're most interested in, which is when we look at it from the idea of risk factors and the idea of things that are of importance, we can see there that at that tight end, which is that 3 to 5, that we've got a pretty good relationship. I've highlighted 3 as the track condition, which is a penetrometer reading of 2.3 to 2.5. And we consider that to be sort of the sweet spot. So we actually have that in our track manager's guide, that the preparation of races in New Zealand is to be aimed at presenting a track with that reading. And so they know going into a race meeting that that is where they want to be heading, and that is the direction of travel. So we want to be heading towards that. And so again, that's sort of, you see that reflected in some of the data that we had, that's the driver that we have in this country to try and race with a track of that going or those measurements. Now, this is just some data that Kylie has pulled out, and it's basically an inverse of what we saw before. But again, it's giving you a bit of an idea of where we're at in the idea of the relative speed. And again, this comes back to a bit of what Peter was talking about the idea there that in Australia, they don't want to race basically on those firm tracks. And you can see they're highlighted in that box where we tend to avoid them. So how many years, what was this the most recent? Oh yeah, so this is sort of a summary of we've reduced the data points so you don't get absolutely blurred, but it's about 15 years data to give you a bit of an indication of the relative relationship of what we're measuring with the penetrometer and the relative speed of these horses, because as you know, has been highlighted before, you know, speed describes the amount of load, and the penetrometer describes not only the magnitude of the way the horse is responding from a musculoskeletal point of view, but also the hoof-ground interaction. So it sort of is quite a nice little indication of where we're at, and you can sort of start to see that there is actually a relationship and a descriptor of what we're measuring, which should be translated back to variation in the nature of the loads that those horses are being exposed to. Now, this is, again, just some data that Kylie's been working on very recently, which is trying to do some seasonal decomposition and time series analysis of this penetrometer data. We've used the track condition scale just on this graph because it's just a little bit more complete, because if we push it back, the nature of the reporting gets a little bit vague as we go further back. And so we know that the track condition score is true, but sometimes in the official transcripts, we're missing some if we go right back. So it gives you a bit of an idea of this periodicity that we see in the nature of the tracks, and the idea of where we start off with in winter in the heavy tracks, it drops right down, and it's a very predictable seasonal pattern to the way that things occur. You'll see in the 2021 section there, or we're a little bit, I should probably mention that our racing season isn't the Northern Hemisphere. We work on a 6-month slide. So we're actually, because of the way we are, our season starts in August and finishes at the end of July. So it's a bit different to the Northern Hemisphere. But again, you can see we've got a highly predictable pattern in the nature of going in these tracks across the years, which is sort of really interesting. And it's, I guess, it talks about the idea while we have variation, and that's something that we've been talking about before, that there is variation in tracks. The nature of having a predictable and highly predictable pattern means that the racing participants can have a sort of a relative degree of certainty as to where they're going to be going with track condition and the relative loads on the horse as you progress through that racing season. This is again track condition score. It's again what we were seeing there with that seasonal decomposition, but giving you a little bit of an idea of the variation that we see in our penetrometer readings across all those tracks, and to give you a bit of an idea of that magnitude of variation. And you know, we talked about this idea of variation in the loads that the horses are exposed to, because you know, there's some nice work that shows that you require, if you change the nature of the going, then you change the nature of the loads that the horses are exposed to. So again, you know, Ewan mentioned the idea of this idea of thresholds and the idea of variation. And so here we've just got some box and whisker plots, the idea of our median values and the idea of the variation and the direction of variation that we have there. And you can see where we're doing most of our racing in that January, February, November, December period. Relatively consistent, relatively tight presentation of tracks with regards to the track surface, and then the nature of living in a long, skinny country with a high rainfall. As we start to head into winter, you can see the effect of that, whereby we're working on drainage rather than the application of water, and the impact that that has on our tracks. And you can see, you know, during our wettest, June, July, you can see it's relatively tight, but the going is pretty consistent. And this has implications when we start looking at the idea of, I'll show you some data that we've pulled out more recently with regards to our incident rate for injuries, which are race day injuries, as an indication of what that variation might mean, or the impact of that variation. Now, this is just really as an idea of frame of reference, because the nature of those loads and what they really mean. So to give you an idea is what Kylie's done here is she's pulled out the data and given you an indication of the variation, and this is the last 600. Yep, so this is the speed of all horses competing in races in New Zealand over the last 600 meters of those races. You've excluded jumps racing. Yep, yeah, which is only about 3% of the races in New Zealand, so there's no jumps racing in there. But this is our flat racing, and it gives you a bit of an idea of the variation in the nature of the speed of the last 600 relative to our synthetic tracks. So the interesting thing is our synthetic tracks run relatively quick, relatively fast, with an average speed of about 17 meters per second in the last 600. Because we aim to have our tracks at that 3, you can see that equates to slightly slower speeds in the last 600 on our turf tracks. And then you get to see the impact of that variation. And I guess part of it is not just the impact of going on that last 600, but the impact of fatigue and the nature of the pattern of racing that occurs during those winter months. Because as you change the track condition, you change basically the relative impact that fatigue and track condition has, and then that creates that larger variation that we're seeing in the final 600 during those winter months. Now, this is sort of where it starts. Oh, I don't know. I guess I think it's relatively interesting. Is the idea here of looking the nature of the track going, which is I better get these figures right. This is the blue line. Yep. And then basically what we've got is the incident rate of injury. So that's, and I'd probably better describe. So this data is based on what we call our reporting. So these are horses that have been requested to have a veterinary examination after the completion of a race, based on either not running up to speed, or what we call running on merits. So they ran at a lower placing than was expected, or the vet or the steward identified that there was something perhaps that required an inspection and an examination of these horses. So this sums everything from subtle lameness all the way through to fracture. Yeah, it does have fracture. No, fracture's excluded out of this one, isn't it? Yeah. So this is just musculoskeletal injury. But the interesting thing, I'll describe it, but the initial pattern that you see there, we've got, and you'll see there's a gap, that's where we did some data mining, and that was based on what we had, which was a paper-based system. So, and the joys, those of you that are involved in race day regulation and data integrity, as soon as you've got a paper-based system and people have choices in what they put the data in, it adds an extra complexity that nobody wants to see. So we had a little bit of caution with the data that was on the left-hand side because it was based on the paper-based system. What we've then got with the start of the yellow lines, which is the new data set, is the online recording system. And this, Michaela reported about this. This improved the integrity of the race reporting, the consistency in the reporting. So we're starting to say, okay, we've got probably much more confidence in the nature and the pattern of the reporting that we're seeing here, because this is based on an online app where people are recording it the veterinarians and the stewards are recording it as it happens live at the racetrack. I've put in those little blue arrows there, which probably it's absolute overkill in overemphasizing the temporal pattern. But what you see there is, as we see a drop in what we call the track condition, which is basically meaning as we're moving from winter into spring and we get into that better going, we see a small spike in our incident race of injuries, and then they drop down and become consistent. So what this is sort of providing, I guess, is a bit of an indication that what we're seeing is where we have more variation in our track measurements in our penetrometer data, we then start to see that there is a small spike, or a spike in the incident rate of the injuries that are reported on race day. And this might allude to, we've got horses that are starting their campaign, so it's part of that cyclic load and the idea of where these horses are with regards to loading. But it may also start to tell us a little bit of a story that it's variation in that track surface as we move from a less firm to a firmer track, which actually has implications on the injury rates that we are observing. And I mean, this is all data that we've been playing with. I shouldn't say playing with. we've been intensely analysing, but over the last couple of weeks, just sort of having a bit of a look and a bit of a suck and see. So we haven't run a huge amount of analysis on it. This is a bit of an indication of some of these patterns that we're starting to observe, and perhaps, you know, the opportunity to develop some hypotheses around these. This is again just now, what have you done here? You've done a seasonal decomposition, yep, of that data before. And again, just another way of presenting that data, but to give you an indication, as you can see, the rapid increase in the firmness of the tracks and the change from variable to consistency. There's that lag, and then you start seeing the injury rates and the temporal pattern there. So is there anything else? Have I missed anything on that? No. Okay. Yep. So again, just trying to show that this idea that perhaps track condition is important, but it might be the fact that as we move and changes in track condition that those horses are exposed to within a campaign can have a major impact at a population level on those injury rates that we start to observe. So really, you know, we're a little bit odd in that we've got a relatively autonomous population running predominantly on turf tracks of a very similar geometry, which in theory provides similar load exposures. We've found the penetrometer and the use of that as a reference has been well accepted, and it does describe not just the, you know, as we saw with the speed there, it doesn't just describe the speed, which is a good proxy for the way the horse is interacting, but if we look at the work that Jack Murphy does, it does describe the material properties of what that penetrometer is exposed to. So it's a nice summary of that moisture content, which is giving you the yield, but also the inherent material properties of that surface that they're interacting with. And then, yeah, a little bit that we've been able to link, and partly it's been constrained. We've constrained ourselves to the online database where we started to get the very tight recording of race day injury data, because it's got better definition. It's much cleaner with regards to the categorization of where the injuries are and what they are. And there's an indication there, which Michaela put in her paper, that we're starting to see a bit of an association. So once we get outside that sweet spot of 3 and we get into that firm, or just on the very lower levels for the penetrometer in that what we call our sweet spot, that we start to see an increase in the incident rate of the injuries as identified by the stipendiary stewards and the veterinarians. So it's a hint that, you know, we're starting to get a bit of an idea in our racing jurisdiction with the geometry of our tracks and the way that we race and train, that we may have a little bit of a threshold that we really want to avoid, and we can start perhaps looking at that and getting a better idea of saying how large is that threshold, and do we need to slide a little bit further back, or what do we need to do to try and avoid moving out of that sweet spot and getting into a situation where we start to see the possibility of the going having an impact on our injury rates and our fracture rates. All right, so that was our sort of very brief sort of summary of how we use the penetrometer and how that sort of fits in, and the way that we've used it, and I guess the setup of racing in New Zealand, because that does have an impact on, you know, we talk not only about the nature of going, but the geometry of the tracks and the relative impact that has on the hoof ground interaction probably is of importance. So all yours, Mick.
Thank you, Chris.